Today I am going to discuss the GDP. What is GDP? GDP is most important for calculating the national income. GDP abbreviation is Gross Domestic Product. It is defined as GDP is the total value of all final goods and services produced in a country in an accounting year. Accounting year will be start from 1st April to next year March 31st. So next it has been defined. We can say that it is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country in a given time period. The definition has four parts: market value, final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period. GDP have three types: nominal GDP, actual numbers in today's dollars. Next, real GDP, adjusted for inflation, which allows to more easily comparing dollars. Per capita average GDP per person. Next is, what is the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP? Nominal GDP, it measures the value of domestic production prices from the current year, that is GDP in current dollars. Next, real GDP, it measures the value of domestic production from the prices of a base year, that's based on constant dollars. Next, using GDP, most nations release GDP data every month and quarter. In the US, the Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes an advance release of quarterly GDP 4 weeks after the quarter ends, and a final release 3 months after the quarter ends. The BEA releases are exhaustive and contain a wealth of detail, enabling economists and investors to obtain information and insights on various aspects of the economy. So, GDP data is next. History of GDP. GDP is first came to light 1937 in a report to the US Congress in response to the Great Depression. Conceived of and presented by an economics at the National Bureau of Economic Research, Simon Cousins. At the time, the preeminent system of measurement was GNP. After the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, GDP was widely adopted as the standard of means for measuring national economies. Though ironically, the US continued to use GNP as its official measure of economic welfare until 1999. After that, it will be switched to GDP. Up to this time, now GDP is indicator of to calculating the national income. Next, GDP and investing. Investors watch GDP since it provides a framework for decision making. The corporate profits and inventory data in the GDP are great resources for equity investors, as both categories show total growth during the period. Corporate profits data also displays pre-tax profits, operating cash flows, and breakdowns for all major sectors of the economy. Comparing the GDP growth rates of different countries can play part in asset allocation, aiding decisions about whether to invest in fast growing economies abroad, and if so, which ones. On the basis of GDP, foreign countries will be decide that country is favorable for investing or not. Criticism of GDP. There are, of course, drawbacks to using GDP as an indicator. In addition to the lack of timeliness, some criticism of GDP as measure, it does not account for several unofficial income sources. That is, GDP relies on official data, so it does not take into account the extent of informal economic activity. GDP fails to quantify the value of under the table employment, black market activity, volunteer work, and household production, which can be significant in some nations. So here is one is second one is to emphasize material output without considering overall well-being. GDP growth alone cannot measure a nation's development or its citizens' well-being, as noted above. For example, a nation may be experience rapid GDP growth, but this may impose a significant cost to society in terms of environment impact and increasing income disparity. Some limitations of GDP. GDP does not take into account certain economic activities such as non-market activities. That is, GDP does not measure goods and services that people make or do themselves, such as caring for children, moving lawns, or cooking dinner. Second one is negative externalities. Unintended economic side effects such as pollution, monetary value that is often not reflected in GDP. Third one is the underground economy. There is much economic activities which, although income is generated, never reported to the government. Examples include black market transactions and under the table wages. Next, quality of life. Although GDP is often used as a quality of life measurement, there are factors not covered by it. These include leisure time, pleasant surroundings, and personal safety. These are the some limitations of the GDP. GDP deflator is a price index that measures inflation or deflation in an economy by calculating a ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. Next, we can calculating the GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is calculated by dividing nominal GDP by real GDP and multiplying by 100. The definition, the formula, GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP into 100. That equation measures price inflation in an economy. It is calculated by dividing nominal real GDP and multiplying by 100. Consider a numeric example. If nominal GDP is $1,000,000 and real GDP is $45,000, then the GDP deflator will be 222. GDP deflator, that's we know that nominal GDP by real GDP into 100. Then GDP deflator is 222.222. Next is nominal GDP. We can explain. The nominal GDP is the value of all the final goods and services that an economy produced during a given year. It is calculated by using the prices that are current in the year in which the output is produced. In economics, a nominal value is expressed in monetary terms. For example, a nominal value can change due to shift in quantity and price. The nominal GDP takes into account all of the changes that occurred for all goods and services produced during in a given year. If prices changes from one period to the next and the output does not change, the nominal GDP would change even though the output remained constant. So that's one nominal GDP. Next is real GDP. It is the total value of all the final goods and services that an economy produces during a given year, accounting for inflation. It is calculated using the prices of a selected base year. To calculate real GDP, you must determine how much GDP has been changed by inflation since the base year and divide out the inflation each year. Real GDP therefore accounts for the fact that if prices change but output doesn't, nominal GDP would change. So that's the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP. GDP is calculated on the basis of three approaches: production approach, income approach, and expenditure approach. P formula is calculated on the basis of expenditure, income, and value added approach. We can see the formula. Next. That's all about the GDP. If you have any doubt, any suggestions, please comment below the video. Thanks for watching. This is most helpful for various competitive examinations and board examination. Thanks once again. Thanks for watching.